Hello and welcome to DNA Today. I'm your host, Kira Deneen. DNA Today informs you on what's happening in the genetic world. The show is packed with news stories, lessons, all to keep you updated and educated on genetics. And since we're at UConn, I'm going to start out with two UConn-related news stories, as well as other news stories to make it a little balanced here. So our first news story is on Wednesday last week, Dr. John Malone, a professor here at UConn in the Department of Molecular and Cell Biology, presented his research for students. And he was really interactive in his presentation and explaining concepts to students in an easy way. It was definitely geared towards students. And it was great to be able to hear from a professor really what his research is doing, because a lot of times in classes we're hearing from them of, what we should be learning in intro level things. But to hear what's actually going on, in genetic research is really awesome. And especially being a student here, you can attend these things. And his research at Malone Labs is focused on gene dosage, meaning the relative amount of genes being expressed compared to others. And his lab strives to discover what genes are on sex chromosomes and expression levels. And he doesn't really focus on a particular disorder, but more of the fundamental concepts. And the particular project he highlighted during his presentation was sequencing the genome of the African bullfrog. And he chose the African bullfrog to sequence the genome of because this organism has a small genome, so it's not too much to work with. There isn't a lot of genetic variation, and so the genome is more streamlined. You don't have a lot of different alleles, different types of the genes, less differences among the organisms in the species. Another reason frogs are great species to study is because they lay eggs, and their eggs are great to study the development. And it's much easier in than in mammals, because then you're in utero and all that. So it's having it external from the mother's body during development really allows for watching how it works. And it's also easier to manipulate the genetics of it. And you can modify it by, poking a needle in and sticking a gene in. So if you want to learn more about what Malone Labs does, you can follow actually on Twitter at Malone Lab and see what they're up to at UConn and everything. And if you're interested in going and attending to these events, I try and tweet about it, but you can check out on UConn's website, and they're usually in the Daily Digest. The Center for Undergraduate Education puts on a monthly STEM seminar, so it's great to be able to attend those, and they're not long, hour usually. Also, I tweet about it at DNA Podcast for any upcoming genetic-related presentations, so keep your eye out there. Our next news story, again, is UConn-related, and I mentioned on the show before that Jackson Laboratories is having their grand opening this month, and it's next week on October 8th, and this is right in Farmington, Connecticut, which is about 50 minutes from here, I want to say. And Jackson Labs has a partnership with UConn, as it's in the campus of UConn Health Center. And little background information on Jackson Labs. It's an independent nonprofit biomedical research institution, and JAX is the short name for it. And JAX Genomic Medicine will discover the precise genomic causes of disease, develop individualized diagnostic treatments and cures, and help build Connecticut's bioscience industry. And being at UConn, this is very exciting because of their partnership, as well as, building this bioscience industry within Connecticut. So it's definitely really exciting for science students and people just interested in science. They focus on medical applications of genomics with academic and clinical research partners from Connecticut and around the world. So it's kind of the hub. And this new site aims to transform medicine by improving care, lowering costs, and increasing lifespan and health span. And in the next 10 years, they're planning on housing 300 biomedical researchers, technicians, support staff, and in state-of-the-art computing laboratories and all of that research and technology. So it's definitely going to be huge, especially for kids graduating the next couple of years. They can start targeting that for applying for jobs and everything. So it's definitely adding a lot to the biomedical field in Connecticut. And Jackson Lab headquarters are in the beautiful Harbor, Maine. They have public tours there, which I highly suggest going on. I went 2 summers ago, and it's really cool to be able to see where the research is really going on and hear from them a little bit more about what they're focused on and how it works and, what it's like to work there. And they have another third site in Sacramento, California. So they are definitely expanding rapidly, and it's an exciting time for Jackson Laboratories. So I'm attending the grand opening next week, and I checked before the show, and it looks like registration is still open, and it's free for UConn students. So you do have to take a day off from classes, but it's a Wednesday. But it'd be so exciting just to be able to be there, and there's so many so many amazing presenters and scientists that are going to be there. The event schedule is pretty packed. It's on their website, and there's a long list of speakers for the day, including Nobel Prize winners, which I was really impressed with. I'm really excited to be able to hear them speak. And the featured guests are representing the National Human Genome Research Institute, University of Utah, Howard Hughes Medical Institute, New York Genome Center, Yale University, and of course, University of Connecticut Health Center, and way others. But those are kind of just the top ones I pulled out. But a lot of people that are really involved and kind of thought leaders in the industry of genetics are going to be there. So it is a big deal. And if you can get yourself there, please do, because it's something I don't think you'll ever forget. The themes at this symposium include clinical genomics, modeling human diseases, genomic technologies, so basically all genetics, genomics, and you'll be able to hear of what's really going on in the world from experts. And definitely be able, if you can go there, get yourself there. And just so you kind of know what's going on in the news for Jackson, other than this huge major opening, recently they were in the news for their Harbor Maine location. And this site received a pledge of $1 million from the Cornelia Cogswell Rossi Foundation to support and name the laboratory's new neurobehavioral biometry center. And this pledge was made in support of developing a greater breadth and depth of knowledge of neurobehavioral testing with an ultimate goal of accelerating the pace of research to improve human health. So they're really focusing on this neurobehavioral. And this center in Bar Harbor will allow scientists to create a database to work from of neurobehavioral information. And it's going to be available internationally in the research community. So they're really pulling together for not Jackson Laboratories is really known for genomic studies in terms of cancer, but they're definitely expanding in terms of having other fields kind of within the molecular biology realm. And so, yeah, they're rapidly expanding and developing, worth keeping your eye on in the news. And their website always has great new stuff, and you can subscribe to their newsletter on there. Really easy to do, and it's nice getting a little email from them once in a while. Our next news story has gained a lot of attention, even outside the genetics news stories, and in the mainstream. And it's been revealed that schizophrenia is not just one genetic disorder, but actually 8. And it's not just, this disorder is affected by a lot of people. It's a little over 1% of the population, which at first may sound like, wow, that's not a lot, 1%. But in terms of genetic diseases, it is a large number. And schizophrenia is a severe mental disorder causing debilitating symptoms such as paranoia, delusions, auditory hallucinations, and impaired social behavior. And again, it's a little over 1% of the population, so probably a lot of people that you know someone. Not all people like cancer. Everybody knows someone that's affected by cancer, but schizophrenia is a really major genetic disorder. And so this information of having this, what we think of as one genetic disorder, actually be 8 distinct genetic disorders, that it's a combination of these 8 diseases that we call schizophrenia. This information was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry, and the research was led by C. Robert Koilinger of Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis. And to go about this research, his team analyzed the genomes of 4,200 individuals diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then 3,800 controls, like control genomes that were not affected by schizophrenia. And they looked at almost 700,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, which are known as SNPs for short, like within this genome. And basically single nucleotide polymorphisms are common locations for genetic variation by only one base pair. So like, the ATCG, by only one of those is going to be different. And the research team was able to attempt to find all of these SNPs that matched in schizophrenic people's genomes that did not match when comparing them to the control genomes. And the matches between schizophrenic people's genomes, while not matching with control, means that it indicates those genes are a cause of the disorder. So through this method, they discovered that it was a total of 42 genetic clusters working together that were responsible for bringing out the symptoms for not one disease, but as I said before, 8 separate disorders. And the lead researcher explained that this concept in a press release with the Washington University in St. Louis, and he said that, quote, genes don't operate by themselves. They function in concert much like an orchestra. And to understand how they're working, you have to know not just who the members of the orchestra are, but how they interact. What we've done here, after a decade of frustration in the field of psychiatric genetics, is identify the way genes interact with each other, how the orchestra is either harmonious and leads to health, or disorganized in ways that lead to distinct classes of schizophrenia. So he explains this very well, but he's talking about how genes they don't just, produce a protein. They encode for a protein, which is then produced. It's not just a one-way street. It's really a complex network of gene interaction to produce different things like schizophrenia. And so they're learning how extensive and how complicated schizophrenia is on the genetic level. Now, not everyone with schizophrenia exhibits all possible symptoms, and therefore they don't have all the same genetic markers causing the illness. It's not that straightforward. The results of this study provide incredibly clear connections between SNPs and symptoms. So certain genetic variations were 95% accurate in predicting delusions and hallucinations, while other SNPs were 100% accurate in estimating speech and behavioral abnormalities associated with schizophrenia. So these numbers are incredibly high, and they're really able to predict the different symptoms. So they're getting way more information to be able to identify schizophrenia and the different types and how some symptoms are apparent and some are not in different people. But this isn't to say that there are no environmental factors. Through research, it's evident that the disorder is attributed to genetics about 80% of the time. So it really is a genetic disorder, but there are a few environmental factors that can come into effect. The lead researcher also mentioned, quote, that people have been looking at genes to get a better handle on heart disease, hypertension, and diabetes, and it's been a real disappointment. Most of the variability in the severe of disease has not been explained, but we were able to find that different sets of genetic variations were leading to a distinct clinical syndrome. So I think that this really could change the way people approach understanding the causes of complex diseases, end quote. So he's really looking at how genes interact and how that's more important in his eyes, and in a research angle, that's more important than actually what genes someone has. So this is kind of a breaking news story, and it was kind of, for me at least, it was all over Facebook, and a lot of people were talking about it. So hopefully there will be a lot of follow-up research stories on here that I'll be able to report for you. But yeah, schizophrenia is no longer seen as one genetic disorder. It's 8 genetic disorders all in one. So crazy stuff happening. Our next news story is somewhat of a follow-up. It's from the medical news today. And last year in May, actress Angelina Jolie made headlines when she announced she underwent a double mastectomy. And this was after she was tested for a positive mutation for the BRCA1 gene, which is heavily linked to breast cancer. If you test positive for the mutation BRCA1, then it is, an indication that you're at a way higher risk to get breast cancer. And so this decision to have a double mastectomy was made after consulting with a genetic counselor. And then she wanted to reduce her risk of breast cancer and went through with the procedures. And since she came out with this story and was very open about it publicly, there's been a surge of women with family history of breast cancer being tested and having the same conversation with genetic counselors. And not necessarily that they all were even tested positive or went through with a double mastectomy or a single mastectomy, but they did have that conversation with genetic counselors and were tested and were able to understand more of what was going on, and is more educated in terms of their genetics and what their options were. And this surge that I'm referring to of so many more women getting tested and looking into this was 2.5-fold an increase in genetic testing. And so this is the research that I'm referring to. This is really the news story that they did research on, how much, how a public news story like this affected people getting genetic testing. And so this research was led by Garth Evans of Geneticist Breast Cancer Prevention and St. Mary's Hospital in the UK. And they expressed that these health news stories, for health news, a story involving a high-profile celebrity can have a major positive, long-lasting impact on healthcare among the general public, that if it is something that's being referred to on the news, and women know that, in this case, women know that they have family history with breast cancer, maybe they'll now go out and get that BRCA1 test and see if they test positive, and then they can go from there and be more educated. So Angelina Jolie actually came out with this herself. She wrote in a self-penned article in the New York Times on May 14th, 2013, expressing her decision and why she's being so public about this. She says, quote, "I chose not to keep my story private because there are many women who do not know that they might be living under the shadow of cancer. It is my hope that they will, too, be able to get gene tested, and if they have a high risk, they, too, will know that they have strong options." So she's not necessarily saying, like, oh, everybody, if they test positive, they should get this. She's just highlighting the fact that people have the option to get tested and go to genetic counselors and be more educated so they can make an educated decision and not just be uneducated and end up getting cancer if they have made a different decision if they knew about it. And researchers found that in June and July 2013, immediately after Jolie's announcement, referrals for genetic testing increased again 2.5-fold. And when comparing with the same period in 2012, so this twofold increase remained until October 2013. So, from May, like late May, whatever, until October, the genetic testing referrals were just amplified, and so many more people were really looking into it. So hopefully more people in the public eye will be open to sharing their genetic testing and different medical experiences so that the public is more aware of this. You actually have this option. You can do this. And, anytime that a high profile celebrity is behind something, it does get a little bit more attention. So it's just cool to know that, numbers wise, it really does make a difference. And now moving on for our geneticist of the week. As most people know, Gregor Mendel is kind of like the father of genetics. So I kind of wanted to get into why he's the father of genetics, what he's known for. And he actually was a monk, for those of you that don't know. And he studied genetics really through pea plants, and it turned out really well for him. And during the time he was doing research was the 1850s, which is so long ago. Genetics seems like such a new erupting field, and it is, but he did start this way before most people really were thinking about traits and things. And the way that he was looking at it, obviously he didn't know what genes were and loci and all of that and specific terms of things, but he just looked at the traits and was able to figure out kind of the inheritance of certain traits by looking at pea plants. And again, this work was done in 1850s, but he published it in 1866. And other scientists did have hypotheses of how traits were passed from parent to child, but most of them were wrong, as a lot of hypotheses are. But his work was published in 1866, but not recognized until the early 1900s. So although this research was done like 50 years before, no one really gave him recognition for it until the early 1900s. And he had died at that point. So unfortunately, as much as we talk about him, he doesn't really know that. And as I mentioned earlier, he did his research through pea plants. And he discovered the same principles of heredity that apply to humans and animals and pretty much a lot of things on the planet. And he chose to use the common pea plant to conduct his experiments. So some other reasons he picked the pea plant was because they could easily be grown in large amounts and their reproduction could be manipulated. Pea plants can self-pollinate because they have both male and female sex structures to the plant. And so it was easy for Mendel to manually breed them by, cutting off one of the sex structures or actually physically putting some of the pollen on. And one observation he had was that the pea plant did not have a blend of traits from two parent pea plants, and instead it showed one trait over the other. So this is where he started figuring out dominant and recessive. When you have something dominant, it is kind of dominating over the recessive trait, and it's going to be shown over the recessive trait. And when two parent pea plants had two different colored flowers, like a white and purple, for instance, the offspring flowers would either be white or purple. So that's showing the dominance there. And it wouldn't be like a mix. It wouldn't be like a light purple or something. It's white or purple. And along with this observation, Mendel found 7 easily recognizable traits in pea plants. And I won't go through all of them, but a lot of things people know is like the yellow or green pod color, or the seed shape is round or wrinkled. So things like that. And these 7 traits had one or the other. So he was able to say, okay, they're either purple or white, or they're either round or wrinkled. So because of this, he really picked like one of the best organisms to study because of its ability to have short generation time and producing a lot of offspring, as well as having very straightforward traits that he could track. And in this time, it was believed that children would show a blend of forms from their parents, and he proved this current theory wrong. He discovered that the offspring would inherit each trait by receiving one factor, now known as a gene, but he called it a factor, from each parent. And this trait may not be exhibited, however, it could still be passed on to another generation. And so that would be like recessive. If you had a dominant allele and you have also recessive, you could pass recessive along, but you're not yourself going to show it. And in today's day and age, like as I said, it's dominant and recessive. And he came up with these 2 principles and was able to explain all these observations through these 2 principles. And that's the principle of segregation and the principle of independent assortment. And the principle of segregation is about the factor I mentioned earlier, now referred to as genes. But Mendel had it right when he said that the normal body cells have pairings of factors, and that the sex cells, these pairs separate. The factors separate during the process of meiosis to produce gametes, and in humans, this would be the sperm cell and the egg. Same for chromosomes. Each gamete only gets 1 out of the pair, so you're getting 1 set of traits, or you're getting 1 set of chromosomes from your dad and 1 from your mom. And now the principle of independent assortment is about the alleles, and that's the different types of genes. It's the different forms of it. And these are at a particular position known as the locus on a chromosome. So these are things that we can now apply to Mendel's knowledge, but back then he was discovering all of this. So everything was new, and he didn't have this bank of knowledge we do now. And alleles separate independently of each other when the gametes are formed, so you're not going to have one chromosome be affecting another. And so Mendel thought different traits are inherited independently from each other, and he was right. All of this was right, and it really is groundbreaking, especially at that time. We didn't even know. Back in 1850s, he was figuring this out. And so the next big discovery in this really was like Mendel's big discovery. So he also kind of delved into principles like looking at different diploids and how sexual reproduction works and all of that, and really looking at how traits are inherited. So he did a lot of groundbreaking work and studied with these pea plants for, generations and years of his life that he was just spending with his pea plants. But he really did set the base for the genetic information that we know. And obviously, because of his work, a lot of work has sprung from that when, the structure of DNA was discovered, as we've discussed on the show before, and things like that. But that's just a little bit of information of Mendel's work and how that all worked. But I'll delve in a little bit to a genetic disorder, and that's cystic fibrosis. I thought we would kind of highlight a genetic disorder this week. And cystic fibrosis is known as CF for short. And this is a disease that causes the body to produce mucus that's really thick and sticky. And it's due to the epithelium being compromised by the disease. And the epithelium consists of cells that line hollow organs and glands that make up the outer surface of the body. So the outsides of organs and things like that. And in a normal, healthy body, the epithelium produces a thin, watery mucus that acts kind of as a lubricant, so nothing's really too dry in there. And so it can kind of move around properly. And a body affected by cystic fibrosis, however, the epithelium produces a thick, sticky mucus, which can build up in the lungs, pancreas, liver, digestive tract, and other organs. So it really is affecting the entire body. And it can then create clogs in the passage to those organs. 2 organs affected most by CF are the pancreas and lungs. That's why a lot of people affected by CF, are coughing all the time. They really can't exercise too much because there's so much of this thick mucus in the lungs that it's hard to breathe properly. And the pancreas produces enzymes to help digestion. So when clogs are formed there, it becomes hard to digest food. The lungs also can have mucus buildup Talking about that, it can also lead to bacteria, which can later cause infections. And CF most commonly affects Caucasians of Northern European descent. And 1 in every 20 people living in the U.S. is actually a CF carrier. So they don't have it, but they're a carrier that if they mated with another CF carrier, they have a 1 in 4 chance of that child inheriting the disease. And unfortunately, there is no cure for this disease, as a lot of genetic diseases don't have cures. But, Jackson Laboratories is working on that. People diagnosed with cystic fibrosis should exercise regularly to loosen the mucus in the lungs. That is kind of suggested by doctors. And symptoms may seem mild, but they do increasingly get worse over time. So CF is a genetic disease that we do know quite a bit about, and I won't get into the molecular level of all that. I was actually studying that last week. But yeah, it's definitely one that's very prevalent, and people know what cystic fibrosis is. Usually if a disease is that prevalent, it's kind of known in the mainstream environment. But it's definitely a serious disorder that really affects everyday life. Well, that's about all I have for you today. But tune in next week, Mondays at 1 p.m. and every Monday at 1 p.m. to learn more about genetics. And if you really can't wait a week, you can check out the website at dnapodcast.com. I have lots of mini lessons on there on genetic concepts that I've kind of done the last couple years. And I think they're really helpful if you're currently taking a genetics course, any kind of genetics course or bio course. And right now you're in the genetics unit, or you will be down the road. I've got lots of lessons on there: transcription, translation, what the DNA structure is, how different things work, replication, all of that good stuff. And sometimes it's hard to digest something in an audio format. So I also have a lot of visuals on there to help. And I have a write-up, like a transcription of what I'm saying on there. So you could also read it too if that's helpful. Because I try and use very simple language because I'm not that much of an expert, so I don't really use a lot of the fancy terms. But yeah, definitely check out the website there. I've got other things there and a lot of other resources that you can go to find more information about genetics and news stories and all of that, because I can only cover so much in half an hour every week. But if you don't really want to have to go around the website and find news stories, I tweet at DNA Podcast, so you can follow me on there if you want. And I'm also my personal account at Kiradineen, Kiradineen on Twitter there. But yeah, on the DNA Podcast account, lots of genetic news stories and retweeting other people. And you could also take a look at the accounts I'm following, because that's a good indicator of, what's going on out there and who you should follow if you're interested in genetics. And also don't forget to check out at Malone Labs on Twitter to see what's going on in Dr. John Malone's lab. And if you have any questions you want answered on air, shoot me an email at info@dnapodcast.com. Thanks for listening, and join me next week to learn and discover new advances in the world of genetics.